and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Ermengarde de Beaumont.
One day we will be remembered.
It's a new season, guys, and a new story, but related to the last one. We're going to go back in history, way back, before the start of season 1. We will get to Ermengarde, but first we have to set the scene. Why was Ermengarde in the position she was in? And the position she was in was that she was a 16-year-old English noble girl about to marry the 44-year-old King of Scotland. And the King of Scotland thought she was far too low-born for that honor. For the backstory, we have to go back a few hundred years. Scotland was made up of the Picts and the Scots, and they were being taken out by the Vikings. Until, in 843, Kenneth MacAlpin was able to unite the Picts and the Scots. With the Picts and the Scots allied, they maybe stood a chance against the Vikings. They started to fight back effectively. With all of that war culture, the Scottish could not sustain one line of succession. The king would die, usually before their sons were old enough to rule. Cue alternating lines of succession. Kenneth's descendants and his brother Donald's descendants taking turns. This solution kept the Vikings somewhat at bay, but that created an internal power struggle between the two royal families. To illustrate this, Shakespeare's Macbeth happens during this time. Shakespeare is historical fiction, but based oftentimes on real people. Macbeth is one of those people during the time when the Scottish royals were turning on each other. This lasted for 24 kings and about 300 years. All of this infighting left one last contender for the throne, King William I. And, ladies and gentlemen, this last great hope, William I, King of Scots, married Ermengarde de Beaumont, our subject for this week. Ermengarde was born around 1170. She was the daughter of a viscount. A viscount, if you remember, is a lower noble, lower than an earl, but higher than a baron. When she was around 16, she married the 44-year-old King of Scotland, King William I, known as William the Lion. He was known as the Lion of Justice, and he was extremely legalistic and wanted things to be fair. Very fair. Mostly for himself. He was one of those it's not fair, I deserve this kind of guys. The marriage had been arranged for them by the King of England, who was the acknowledged overlord of Scotland at the time. To make a long story shorter, England had a rebellion. The king's 3 oldest sons had rebelled along with their mother, and they were being joined by the King of Scotland and the King of France. King Henry II, along with his youngest son John, who was likely just too young to rebel, had won and shut the rebellion down, so his sons were back with their tail between their legs. The Queen of England was under house arrest at Nottingham Castle, the same castle that Prince John was living in Disney's Robin Hood. And Scotland was under the rule of England, meaning that Henry II of England got to choose the wife of King William I of Scots. And King William thought that was BS. He was a king. He didn't like being king underlord. As for the wife of the King of Scotland, Henry picked Ermengarde de Beaumont for King William. King William was not happy about this marriage. He thought Ermengarde was below him. He wanted a more prestigious match. He had hoped to marry the granddaughter of the King of England, but the Pope said nope, and King Henry feigned disappointment. Oh, too bad, the Pope said no. Guess we need a different option. Ermengarde wasn't a princess, but she was descended from a bastard of a former King of England, so that wasn't nothing. Just ask the Tudors and put this in the basket of descendants of royal bastards making up for lost time. Ermengarde's grandmother was the illegitimate sister of King Henry's mother, Matilda, both women being the daughters of King Henry I, making Ermengarde the half-niece of the King of England, but not royal, because her great-grandmother was the king's mistress, not the queen. Henry offered to pay for the whole wedding because, in addition to being a snob, I guess William the Lion was also kind of cheap. Poor Ermengarde. In another time, she would be a high schooler trying to pick out her dress for prom. Now she's just a disappointment to a husband she didn't get to choose. And not a disappointment having to do with her core values or her personality, not even with her looks. He was disappointed with her station at birth. He was a snob. I don't love the age difference, but the year was 1186, and that is what they did. King William was 44, and he had many children out of wedlock. Before he married Ermengarde, he got around. After his marriage, though, he seems to have been faithful to his young wife, who was 16. During this time, the King of England had died, and the new King of England was his son, King Richard I. The king is dead. Long live the king. If you know one thing about Richard I, you probably know that he loved to crusade. Richard the Lionheart, as he was called, famously said, He would sell London to make the money to go on crusade. That's why he's always missing in Robin Hood. He's off on crusade, and his little brother John was like, with my brother gone, I'm kind of king. Ermengarde's husband saw this moment. Though he was the King of Scotland, he was still under the King of England. King William offered to buy Scottish independence for 10,000 marks. That was a lot of money, and Richard took the deal. The King of Scotland was the single largest donor in King Richard's Crusade GoFundMe. And Scotland was again in charge of themselves. So King Richard I of England was off on crusade. Well, he was captured. He had gone missing on his return trip, and it was a whole thing. Bad luck mostly. He was shipwrecked behind enemy lines. The Ottoman Empire wasn't a fan. He attempted to make it to safety, but was captured by Leopold of Austria. His regents knew he had been captured, but his whereabouts were unknown. While imprisoned, King Richard wrote a song about how abandoned he felt by the people of England. Richard was turned over to the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor wanted 150,000 marks for his ransom. That would be 100,000 pounds of silver. Remember when Scotland bought their independence for 10,000 marks? This was only 5 years later, and the King of England would cost 15 times what the country of Scotland had. So Ermengarde's husband saw this moment again. England needed more money, and William had money, because remember, he was real cheap when he wanted to be. Richard's brother John was not wanting to pay the ransom. He wanted to be king. William offered Richard 15,000 marks for northern England. It had worked with Scotland. But Richard said no. He did need the ransom money. But that didn't seem like a good deal. So he said, yes, you can have that land for that amount of money. But I'm keeping all the castles. So that was less fun for William. He was disappointed. Now King Richard's brother, Prince John, was like, I want to be king. My brother can go kick rocks. But Prince John wasn't next in line. He used to have another older brother. That brother was deceased, but had a son named Arthur. John's nephew was supposed to be the next king, but John's nephew was a child, and it was the 13th century. So England was in turmoil and missing their king, and Scotland was backing the teenage Arthur. King Richard was finally ransomed back to England, and he kinged it up for another 5 years, but then he died, shot through the shoulder by a child. It's a long story. I'll get back to that next week. The king is dead. Long live the king. But what king? Teenage Arthur, or his adult uncle, Prince John. John captured his nephew, and Arthur was missing and presumed dead. He was probably killed at the age of 15 or 16, likely on the orders of his uncle, Prince John. Now, King John. The king is dead. Long live the king. He wasn't just a bad guy in Robin Hood. He was also a pretty awful uncle. And now he was King John of England, the first and last. It's not a good sign to be the last monarch of a name. Just ask King Richard III and King Henry VIII. And Scotland had backed the losing side. The Scottish royal family now consisted of King William, Queen Ermengarde, and their 4 children, Margaret, Isabella, Alexander, and Marjorie. John did his king thing for 17 years. It didn't go well. He got on his high horse, and the people were like, nope, this is not the move. So he had to sign the Magna Carta to restrain his own power. He was like, okay, I'll behave, guys. Like, if these are your demands, I'll agree to it. It was a whole thing. And King William was over trying to get on the good side of the King of England. They got into a disagreement. England invaded Scotland and captured their king. King Henry agreed to free the other king on a few conditions. Scotland had to pay for the English occupation of Scotland. King John didn't want to pay that bill. William also had to send all 3 of Ermengarde's daughters to England as a sort of royal hostage situation. Princess Margaret, 16, Princess Isabella, 14, and little Princess Marjorie, who was only just 9, would be sent to England. This would have been devastating to Queen Ermengarde. All 3 of her daughters had been given to a rival king, and the only child she still had with her was 11-year-old Prince Alexander. The sisters were on house arrest in England, but occasionally allowed to go out riding with a heavy guard. The king was getting older, and his health was failing. Ermengarde took over a lot of her husband's duties and wielded considerable influence. They only had 1 son, and they were still a boys-only club, so they needed to secure their son's succession. Think Disney's Brave. They weren't ready for a Merida. Things weren't going smoothly for the royal family of Scotland. In 1212, 70-year-old King William was too elderly and ill to go on a state visit to England, and 42-year-old Ermengarde went instead. She asked the English king for support of their son when he became the next king of Scots. Alexander was knighted there, and there was talk about the young Prince Alexander marrying the daughter of King John. He was still very young, and his father was already 70. Alexander would be a young king who needed English support, and they got that support just in time, because King William died just 2 years later of natural causes at the age of 71. His wife, Ermengarde, was at his side, now a widow at the age of 44. The king is dead. Long live the king. 16-year-old King Alexander II, the same age his mother was when she first married the last king. This was the first father-to-son succession in Scotland. There were still quite a few rival factions, and young kings were risking a lot. The men of Scotland weren't producing enough boys to stick to their boys-only club, and it created drama. The clans MacWilliam and Macbeth rebelled against their new king. The new king weathered that storm and put down the rebellion. Men were beheaded. Down in England, things were not better. King John was sleeping with everyone's wives and most of their daughters. So Alexander invaded northern England, and he had support from the North England barons. King Alexander burned Newcastle. He was in it to win it. While John was fighting the Scots, the southern barons invited the Prince of France to come over and also invade, because King John had a lot of enemies. The northern rebels were siding with Scotland, and the southern nobles were backing France, and approximately almost no one was supporting King John. So John was like, hold on, I need to go fight the French in the south. BRB. King Alexander took that as a retreat and followed him. England was such a disaster under King John that King Alexander made his way to the south and parlayed with France. He was like, how about let's split it? I only want the north. The unpopular King John, the first and last, then died at the age of 49. Because of all this war, combined with questionable water sources, led to dysentery and death. The king was dead. But this unpopular king was the problem, and the whole reason the nobles were rebelling in the first place. With him dead, they went back to supporting a free England, because John had a son. The king is dead. Long live the king. The 9-year-old King Henry III. As had been the original plan, King Alexander married the new king's sister. Alexander was 23. Joan was not quite 11. Ermengarde was now the 50-year-old queen mother. Ermengarde spent her reign as queen mother devoted to the foundation of a Cistercian abbey. She was quite formidable as the mother of a king. She had a lot of influence over her son. And the Queen of Scotland was just a little girl. Ermengarde visited the abbey she had created often with her son the king, and many times she stayed there. But her son's marriage was a mismatch. Besides the age difference, they didn't seem to care for each other too much. Queen Joan moved back down to England to be near her family. Ermengarde then died around 1234, at about the age of 64. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's kind of a poetic year to die. And that is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think of Ermengarde de Beaumont? Even with my brief summary, this episode is still going to be short, because 1234 was a long time ago and we only have so much information. Ermengarde was married young to a much older man who was also a king. I can't imagine Ermengarde was any more excited about that than her snobby husband. Her first child wasn't born until 7 years into the marriage, leading me to believe there was some getting to know you time early in their marriage, and for that at least, I'm thankful on Ermengarde's behalf. She seems to have done well as queen, earning Scotland's nobility's approval, and running the country when her elderly husband wasn't able to. Then she spent the rest of her life devoted to the Catholic Church. She had a long life for that time, and while I assume it was hard and stressful, she handled it extraordinarily well. Then she was able to spend her final 2 decades with God, a choice she was able to make for herself, and I think that was probably her happiest, most calm part of her life. And with that, Ermengarde's episode has ended. I'm excited to start a new story. There will be crossover episodes with Season 1, so it's just adding more flavor to the story we started 34 weeks ago. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com. or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can support it at buymeacoffee.com/longlivethequeen or share with friends and enemies alike. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.
One day we'll be remembered.
Thanks for listening.